The Cocoanut Grove disaster was not simply a fire that broke out on a winter night in Boston. It was the final eruption of a long, invisible buildup of risk, negligence, cultural attitudes, and unchecked authority that had been quietly accumulating for years, waiting for a single spark to transform celebration into mass death. To fully grasp the enormity of what happened, one must imagine Boston in late 1942 not merely as a city, but as a pressure vessel of emotion and movement. The United States was less than a year into World War II, and Boston was one of the nation's most important wartime ports. Sailors passed through daily, uniforms filled the streets, factories ran without pause, and families lived in a constant state of restrained fear, reading headlines about distant battles while wondering who would not return. In such an atmosphere, places like the Cocoanut Grove became emotional refuges, sanctuaries where fear could be temporarily drowned in music, alcohol, laughter, and closeness. The nightclub offered not just entertainment but psychological relief, and that demand allowed it to operate with a level of tolerance that would otherwise have been unacceptable. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, tucked into Boston's Bay Village neighborhood, but inside it promised glamour and escape, a manufactured tropical paradise designed to make patrons forget the cold, the war, and the future waiting beyond its doors. The interior of the Cocoanut Grove was a triumph of illusion and a disaster of engineering. Artificial palm trees stretched toward low ceilings draped in cloth and paper, bamboo-style trim-lined walls, mirrors reflected dim lights, and narrow passageways wound through the building like veins. The layout was not the product of careful planning but of years of improvisation. Rooms were added, walls were shifted, staircases narrowed, and exits repurposed as the club expanded in popularity. Safety was never the guiding principle, atmosphere and profit were. The licensed occupancy of approximately 460 people was treated as a suggestion rather than a limit. On busy nights, especially weekends and holidays, crowds far exceeding capacity were admitted without hesitation. On the Saturday night after Thanksgiving in 1942, with servicemen on leave and the city restless for distraction, the Cocoanut Grove filled beyond reason. Later investigations would suggest that more than 1,000 people were inside, packed shoulder to shoulder in spaces never meant to hold them. Movement was already restricted before the fire began. Patrons squeezed past one another, waiters struggled to navigate between tables, and many guests had no clear awareness of where exits were located, assuming that if danger arose, instinct would guide them out. The fire began quietly, almost invisibly, in the Melody Lounge, a basement-level bar that was inherently dangerous simply by existing below ground. The lighting was intentionally dim, creating intimacy but also hiding hazards. When a light bulb failed near one of the artificial palm decorations, a staff member attempted to correct the problem using an open flame, a match or lighter, an act that reflected the casual improvisation that had become normal in the club's operation. When the flame brushed the palm decoration, the result was instantaneous. The highly flammable material ignited with shocking speed, flames racing upward as if the ceiling itself had been soaked in fuel. Within seconds, thick black smoke poured across the basement, carrying toxic gases that burned lungs and blinded eyes. There was no gradual warning, no slow realization. The fire moved faster than understanding. Patrons had barely enough time to stand before the air itself became lethal. Smoke accumulated faster than escape was possible, and many people in the Melody Lounge were overcome where they sat, collapsing unconscious within moments, never reaching the stairs, never knowing what had truly happened. The fire surged upward through stairwells and corridors, driven by air currents and fueled by the club's decorations, spreading with a speed that defied intuition. It behaved less like a typical fire and more like a flash, transforming rooms from safe to unsurvivable in seconds. Lights failed almost immediately, plunging the building into darkness. Music stopped abruptly. Laughter turned to screaming. Panic erupted, raw and uncontrollable. People ran blindly, colliding with furniture, walls, and one another. Friends lost grip of hands. Couples were torn apart in the crush. The building's confusing layout, which had once seemed charming, became a lethal maze. Exits were hidden behind curtains or decorations, blocked by furniture, or simply unknown to patrons who had entered through one door and assumed it was the only way out. Some exits were locked, a common practice intended to control movement and prevent unpaid departures, but in those moments it became a death sentence. Doors that opened inward were rendered useless the instant crowds pressed against them, transforming basic architectural choices into fatal barriers. The main entrance on Piedmont Street, equipped with a revolving door, became the most infamous symbol of the disaster. As smoke and heat spread, hundreds of people surged toward it, believing it to be their only escape. The revolving door jammed almost immediately under the pressure of bodies. Those at the front were pinned against glass and metal, unable to move forward or backward. Those behind continued pushing, unaware that escape was blocked, adding their weight to the mass. The result was a dense, immovable wall of humanity. Lungs were compressed. Ribs broke. Air vanished. Many people died standing upright, so tightly packed that they could not fall, suffocating slowly as smoke filled their lungs. Later, rescuers would find victims frozen in place, still on their feet, held upright by the sheer density of bodies around them, a sight that haunted those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Elsewhere in the club, desperation drove people to acts of frantic courage. Windows were smashed with chairs, bottles, and bare fists. Glass cut skin as people clawed their way out. Some managed to leap into the cold night air, injured but alive. Others were trapped by dead ends, locked doors, or collapsing crowds. Clothing ignited. Hair caught fire. Heat intensified so rapidly that survival windows shrank to seconds. Many victims never saw flames at all. They were overcome by smoke inhalation, their lungs destroyed by superheated, poisonous air that rendered them unconscious almost instantly. In the Melody Lounge, conditions were unsurvivable almost from the first moments, and survival there was nearly non-existent. It became a sealed grave beneath the chaos unfolding above. The Boston Fire Department received the alarm at approximately 10:23 p.m., and within minutes engines, ladder trucks, and rescue crews converged on Piedmont Street, their sirens cutting through the cold night air. Yet even this rapid response could not undo what had already been set in motion. By the time firefighters arrived, the Cocoanut Grove had already become a sealed environment of death. Flames burst violently from windows, shattering glass outward onto the street, while thick columns of black smoke poured upward into the sky, illuminated by firelight and emergency lamps. The air itself felt heavy, acrid, and hostile. Bodies lay piled at entrances, stacked so tightly that it was difficult to distinguish where one person ended and another began. Some victims were still upright, frozen in place by the crush of bodies around them, their final moments defined by suffocation rather than flame. Survivors staggered out into the street in shock, some naked or half-dressed after their clothing burned or was torn away in the chaos, their skin blistered and raw, hair singed or completely gone, eyes wide and unfocused, staring without truly seeing. Many were silent, unable to speak or scream, their shock so deep it bordered on emptiness. Others collapsed on sidewalks, gasping for air, coughing up soot and blood, their lungs already irreparably damaged. Firefighters moved instinctively, smashing windows with axes, forcing doors with brute strength, and crawling into the building despite unbearable heat and near-zero visibility. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by flickering firelight and the beams of flashlights cutting briefly through smoke before being swallowed again. The floor was slick with spilled drinks, water, and bodily fluids, making footing treacherous. Firefighters advanced by touch as much as sight, hands brushing walls, furniture, and bodies. They dragged victims out one by one, sometimes discovering too late that the person they had pulled free was already dead. Many firefighters collapsed outside from smoke inhalation and exhaustion, coughing violently, their faces blackened with soot, only to rise again moments later and return inside. Again and again they re-entered the building, driven by the knowledge that someone somewhere inside might still be alive. Later, many described stepping on bodies in the darkness, feeling limbs beneath their boots, unable to tell whether they were moving among the living or the dead, the boundary between rescue and recovery dissolving completely in the chaos. The fire itself was brought under control relatively quickly, but the scene remained one of profound horror, a silent testimony to how little time there had been and how many lives had been lost before help could even arrive. As the fire scene unfolded, Boston's medical system was thrown into an immediate and unprecedented crisis. Ambulances were quickly overwhelmed, their numbers utterly insufficient for the scale of the disaster. Police cars, taxis, private vehicles, delivery trucks, and even civilian automobiles were pressed into service, carrying the injured at high speed through the city streets. Hospitals began receiving victims almost simultaneously, wave after wave, until emergency rooms overflowed within minutes. Doctors, nurses, interns, and medical students were summoned from their homes in the middle of the night, arriving still in street clothes, barely briefed before being thrown into chaos. Hallways, waiting rooms, lobbies, and stairwells were converted into makeshift wards. Stretchers lined every available space. Victims arrived with catastrophic burns covering much of their bodies, skin peeling away at the slightest touch, while others bore no visible injuries at all but were suffering devastating internal damage from smoke inhalation. Their lungs were burned, their airways swollen shut, their oxygen levels plummeting without obvious warning. Shock set in rapidly. Pain was immense and relentless. At the time, medical understanding of burn treatment was limited, and staff were forced to improvise under unimaginable pressure. Fluids were administered without the benefit of modern protocols. Infection control was primitive by today's standards. Doctors worked with urgency and desperation, knowing that many patients who appeared stable would deteriorate rapidly within hours. The emotional strain on medical staff was enormous. They treated victims who begged for water they could not safely be given, who asked repeatedly about friends or loved ones who would never arrive, who slipped into unconsciousness mid-sentence. Identification of the dead became a prolonged and agonizing process. Many bodies were burned beyond recognition, their faces unidentifiable, fingerprints destroyed. Authorities relied on jewelry, dental records, fragments of clothing, and personal effects recovered from pockets or hospital beds. Families crowded hospitals and morgues, clutching photographs, wedding rings, scraps of clothing, desperately hoping for confirmation of life and fearing confirmation of death. For many, the answer came hours or days later, delivered in a quiet room, a single sentence that erased entire futures in an instant. By morning, the full scale of the disaster became undeniable and inescapable. 492 people were confirmed dead. Hundreds more were injured, many permanently scarred, disabled, or psychologically shattered in ways that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Boston fell into a collective mourning unlike anything the city had ever experienced. Entire social circles vanished overnight. Young couples who had gone out dancing after Thanksgiving never returned home. Servicemen who had survived combat overseas died in a place meant for laughter and music. Families awoke to empty beds, unanswered phones, and an absence that could not be explained to children or parents. Funerals followed one another without pause, day after day. Churches filled with black clothing and quiet sobs. Neighborhoods grew unnaturally quiet as grief settled into the city like a fog. Boston struggled to comprehend how so many lives could be erased in mere minutes by a fire that should never have been possible in the first place. The investigations that followed peeled back layer after layer of negligence, revealing that the disaster was not the result of a single mistake, but of a system that had failed at every level. Fire inspections had been superficial, rushed, or ignored entirely. Overcrowding was routine and tolerated because it was profitable. Flammable decorations were permitted without serious scrutiny. Exits were hidden behind curtains, blocked by furniture, locked to control patron movement, or designed in ways that made them useless in an emergency. Emergency lighting was inadequate or non-existent. No evacuation plan had ever been established or practiced. Responsibility was diluted across owners, managers, inspectors, and authorities until accountability became elusive and fragmented. Though public outrage was intense and criminal responsibility was discussed, meaningful justice felt limited. The nightclub's owner died shortly after the fire, and while civil lawsuits followed, financial settlements offered little comfort to families who knew, with devastating clarity, that the tragedy had been entirely preventable. Yet from this devastation emerged changes that permanently reshaped public safety. The Cocoanut Grove disaster became a defining turning point, forcing governments, architects, engineers, and medical professionals to confront the real and irreversible cost of ignoring safety. Fire codes were rewritten and strengthened, requiring outward opening doors, clearly marked and unobstructed exits, strict occupancy limits, fire-resistant materials, and reliable emergency lighting. Revolving doors could no longer serve as sole exits. Fire inspections became more rigorous, enforcement more aggressive, and complacency far less tolerated. In medicine, the desperate treatment of Coconut Grove victims led to breakthroughs in burn care, fluid resuscitation, infection control, and disaster response, laying the foundation for modern burn units and emergency medicine practiced around the world today. The Coconut Grove nightclub itself no longer exists, its physical structure erased from the city, but its legacy is inseparable from the lives lost within its walls. The disaster was not an act of fate, nor a moment of unavoidable bad luck. It was the final consequence of choices made repeatedly over time, choices that valued atmosphere over safety, profit over preparation, and convenience over human life. Remembering the Coconut Grove disaster is not simply an exercise in history. It is a warning carved into collective memory, a reminder that safety regulations are written not in ink or policy manuals, but in lives, and that when those safeguards are ignored, the cost is measured in silence, empty streets, unanswered phones, and futures that never had the chance to unfold.